Thanks everybody for coming. It's great. It's our last lecture today in the Tuesday at 7 Eats Architects via this semester. I immediately thought with English because Job Floris, our guest today, he understands a lot of German. He works in Germany. He's speaking Dutch today. He says he doesn't speak German. He only wants to speak English. But that's why we just immediately start in English. And yeah, the last lecture of today, we would have all contained here because at the end of the semester sometimes it's disappointing, but great. About Job Floris, he is one of the two partners of MONADNOCK Architects, the office in Rotterdam. He founded together with Sandor Naus, his associate, his partner. MONADNOCK built up quite a remarkable sort of body of work and very, very outspoken key idea on architecture, where he will tell us about Job. Is to say he has a bit special background. He did Academy for Visual in Breda, so he's from Breda, the south of the Netherlands. It's a different area than the Randstad. The Randstad is more the commercial part, and the south is more the physical part. And he did afterwards the Academy of Architecture in Rotterdam, which is also a very special training. It's a very, very tough job. So you work and you study at the same time. So these people work really a lot. They work like hell, they work burnouts, and he's one of the people who survived that with success, which is good. He works. He has a relationship with Belgium. He worked for Christian Kieckens, who unfortunately died a while ago. Famous Belgian architect. He worked for another office in Antwerp, Poulissen Partners. He worked for Christian Rapp until 2006 in Rotterdam, still, I guess. He publishes. He was editor of OASE, so he's really in the intellectual reflection on architecture, not only in production but also in teaching. So he was teaching at the Academy in Rotterdam, where he was a student. He was also lecturer, and he was guest professor at the EPFL in Lausanne. So there's quite a series of remarkable buildings, like the fourth building, the private housing. I don't tell now all this. He will show the projects. There's a new body of work. A warm welcome for Job. Please.
Thank you for this introduction, Andre. I've never been introduced before as a Brabant guy, which is true, so completely right. Thank you. I will try to shed some light on the title How to Work There throughout the lecture. And today I will serve you 6 projects. It's a cocktail of projects that are finished and have been published, and projects that are currently under construction in our hands, on our tables. Despite the variety of their location and scale, the ambition is to actually illustrate the realm of thinking about architecture. So what I will do, I will start with a rather long introduction, and then I will go to the projects. So be a bit patient. The office is located in Rotterdam along the River Maas. As Andre already introduced me, it's not only me, it's a joint venture with the whole office and also with Sandor Naus, a partner in crime. Sandor has worked together with me at the Poulissen Partners in Antwerp, and then started working at NVRDV in Rotterdam. But I worked at Rapp. And by means of tradition, I always start a lecture with telling a bit more about the name of our office, because it's not only a name, it's also an idea. And the word monadnock comes from a type of mountain. And we only found this out by encountering this beautiful building in Chicago, which carries the name Monadnock. And we completely fell in love with this building for several reasons. It's one building with one name, but it's designed by two pairs of architects, and it contains two architectural languages combined in one building. Two architectural languages also. The left part of the building, here you can see the complete building, was realized by Oliver and Roche, and the right part by Burnham and Roos. Over a period of approximately 15 years. One part was built in load-bearing masonry. It's one of the biggest structures in brick, of course enforced by pieces of steel, but the main material is brick. The other part is built in the material of the future. It's steel frame. It's a steel frame construction. When we talk with people and ask to indicate which part was first and which part is oldest, architects and also non-architects tend to indicate the newest part by Oliver and Roche as being the oldest part. Now, I think that is an intriguing issue. Why would this actually happen? I think it reveals something about the general perception of what old and what new is, and about our ideas on time. I think it fuels also the thinking of our in our practice, the thinking about what is the perception of old and new. I think, for example, if we look at the part of Oliver and Roche, which is here on the left side again, it's the amount and type of ornamentation used by Oliver and Roche is very figurative. It's a very figurative type of ornamentation, and personally I'm most in favor of the brick part because of the special technique and refinement of the brickwork. And the architect John Wellborn-Root was not referring to classical Greek architecture, but instead he studied Egyptian architecture, which is resonated in the way he dealt with the articulation and refinement of the part of Burnham and Root. It's, you could say, thought of as a piece of clay. He seems to have modeled the block into the right shape, allowing himself no other additive elements and materials for making characteristic and tangible buildings. And I would say that perhaps the perception of that part of the building is considered to be modern because it's a bit more abstract. Look at this corner. It's gradually going from sharp to rounded over a height of 17 floors. And what I learned from this is that Root has specifically chosen not to use any additives, but all the refinement comes out of this masonry itself. It's perhaps a bit like a, well, I will not say that it's like a sculptor, but he was very aware of making refinements in this big urban building. Now, this is the meeting between the two building pieces. Anyway, you see the entrances, the left one by Oliver and Roche, and the other by Burnham and Root. And again, the difference in corners. Now, I would say, although our name comes from an old building in Chicago, we are actually not so nostalgic about this era. So this building was realized in 1892. We find quite some interest in this building, whose validity and strength have not faded over the years. So this building embodies one of the main fields of interest and research in our practice, the representation and perception of history and contemporaneity in architecture. In our work, we tend to use historical precedents because of proven or forgotten status, rather as an operational tool than as a justification. Projects might not look alike or have a clear style. We do have a method and an attitude of working and using conventions and historical examples form an important element to avoid making incidents or doing acrobatic inventions. Instead, we rather seek for passing on and bridging in an eclectic, light and playful way. So, an overall idea that is partially stated by the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who formulated the idea of threefold presence, which stands for articulating a relationship with the presence of the past, the presence of the present, and the presence of the future. And this Mr. Ricoeur saw it as a merit of true action when all these dimensions can be brought together in one singular moment. So, when working on architecture, when reflecting on architecture, when talking about architecture, the idea of the threefold presence is rather in front of our minds. And we interpret this also as a political or social economical statement. Architecture seeking for continuity, valuing the achievements of the past, while simultaneously embracing current tendencies in society as a whole. This means also thinking about the conditions of living in our cities, how to keep our cities healthy, working on implementing sustainability. Now, I'm showing this book by Apostle Matthias Ungers because from this we've learned to work on architecture as a discipline. This means that all expressions related to the discipline are part of architecture. In the book, Architecture as a Theme, Ungers states, an architecture that does not derive its themes from itself is like a painting that tries to be nothing more than a photographic reproduction. And embracing architecture as a language with its own words, its own logic, habits and rules, architecture which is logical and understandable, containing a clear set of problems and solutions. Yet, although this Ungers book represents the fundamental thinking, it's not covering the complete story for us. There are also other friends on the table. One that whispers to discover the voice, like Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. We learn from them how architecture can be charged. Hi. It's okay. It's charged with architectural narratives in order to literally find character and making exceptions. This requires making explorations, testing things, making variants, experimenting something we love. This means sometimes meshing up typologies, assembling parts of typologies. It requires research. Sometimes it's too much and we lose the understanding of our audience, and sometimes we manage to be late. So there's a lust for understanding a wide range of architectures. We tend to have a non-dogmatic approach. This includes feeling inspired and attracted by the joy and lightness of certain postmodern architecture. So we like these simple and pragmatic buildings which are simultaneously stuffed with narrative, symbols, and science. And this includes the thinking about the conditions of our cities. In the current time frame, things seem to have become rather incoherent and loose. So while we need places with a clear and defined identity instead of incidents, that neglects any understanding of making city. the fabric, the European border of the city, is that urgent or valid any longer? Yes, it is, we think. So we architects need to keep relating to the fabric of the city. Sometimes this just means being quiet. Sometimes this means being louder than the fabric demands. Now, how to work better is not something I invented. It's an artwork by the Swiss artist Fischi and Weiss that have made this with a very good instruction for all of us architects, I think. So it's not only for artists, but also for architects. Besides a helpful daily reminder, it also touches upon some questions we're facing in our practice and in architecture in general, because we deal with all sorts of questions concerning our environment. We want to make sustainable buildings, for example, but how? For a while we thought that building heavy, robust structures would be the ultimate answer, yet the answer currently seems to diverge. The spectrum of answers seems to grow larger. It makes choosing for a single direction a bit incomplete and limited. So can we also imagine making light buildings which cost less energy to get realized, and would they then have a shorter lifespan? When we think of non-extractive architecture that leaves no traces, we would be thrilled to explore this. We love brick, but can we think of alternative materials that age well, and also understandable and easy to handle, or make hybrids? We're currently preparing a wooden building with a brick cladding. Questions like these we need to ask ourselves. So this was a long introduction. Now I switch over to the projects, and I start with two temporary structures. One is an old one, that's a beach pavilion. We designed quite some years ago in the city center of Rotterdam. So, like every big city in Europe, in the summer there's a beach created, a temporary beach created in the city center for city dwellers to hang out. This city beach required a pavilion, and we designed the pavilion with two faces, one facing the city and the other the beach. It's a temporary structure. It's a steel, detachable steel structure cladded with wood. And like I said, it's a sort of Janus head containing two faces. The big one that shouts to the city, wants to be very visible, and the other one is more modest and human skilled, I would say. We were very intrigued by this image of a New York skyline, which was overtaken by publicity signs. Actually, the silhouettes of the buildings are nearly invisible because they're completely taken over. So we were wondering, could we also imagine making a building that is a sign, a publicity sign? So we designed a billboard that very literally said Sint, which I think is the same in German, isn't it? Yes, it is. And in the middle we made a hole where you could enter. And when you put a very thin layer of sand in the middle of the city and put a fence around it, people start to behave differently, beach clothing, and we let's say, recognized that this beach needed to have a very clear entrance, so we looked at typologies of gatehouses, which actually express the idea of entering and leaving. And we looked at typologies of what rural Americas adopt, trot house, for example, that is one roof with two pavilions, or actually a hole in the middle, which allows the cattle to pass, as I've understood. So it's more than a billboard. Behind the billboard, there's a structure that is built for passing through, and this splits up, of course, the whole building, but not completely. On the first floor, where you enter, there's a bar, and you choose to go into this bar, or you could go down the stairs, and then you would end up on the beach itself. And on the ground level, there is also a second bar and a restaurant. So this is after entering through the publicity sign, you are in a sort of wooden environment. And if you walk straight ahead, then you have a beautiful view over the city and the river and the bridge on the veranda. And this is the backside of the building, which is more modest in scale. It's more humble, I would say, more attuned to the scale of the visitors. And it needs to shout and attract people. So it was very important that it should not contain any real publicity sign like Coca-Cola or anything else, but only the announcement of the beach that is behind it. It was quite successful for 2 years, and then there were some riots, and the mayor actually prohibited a third time. And then we had to say goodbye to our firstborn, so to say. That's also something that happens with temporary structures. That hurts a bit, but it's part of the game we learned. It also led to more temporary structures. And for us, we started our practice with the idea that we would work on projects for 2 or 3 years, serious buildings, housing, for example, but then these temporary structures crossed our path and we embraced it because it's a sort of laboratory in public space where you can actually do experiments and take risks because they disappear again. That's a bit different with a serious building. So this was an installation for only 10 days on a festival terrain in the city center of Utrecht. And it was there as a stage, and there was a bar underneath. What we learned from this was that there was a whole spectacle of visitors acting like, let's say, spectators, but also as people that were visible for other people around. So there was a nice interaction. We also sometimes collaborate with artists like Gabriel Lester, and we then make an installation in the Schöne Kunsthalle here in Frankfurt, which is a beautiful building, but also a very difficult building with a very narrow, long exhibition space. And we were invited to design an installation there, which is the circle, as you can see here, which is exactly between 2 walls. And the artist, Gabriel Lester, invited us to design a space for his sound installation, which was based on suspense and whispering. And he actually made several points with different voices that would create a sort of circuit. He needed a space for this, and we said we make a very clear circular space, which is just between the walls of the room, and then we create a labyrinth in between, which is not so clear any longer, and that will add up to the suspense of the whispering voices. So it's a very simple structure, and then in this structure we make windows and doors. And that means that you have an overview. You can always look to the end of the structure, but simultaneously you can't literally walk there. So it's a rather abstract installation. And then once you enter, you really have to find your way. This can only be done in a museum, of course, not in public space, also not in a house. And we spent quite some time on finding the right texture because we didn't want it to be too abstract. And of course, there's the joy of the light that also gives an extra layer. So there's a sense of disorientation, something you normally not do in a building. Good, then I move over to another project. That's the Atlas House in Eindhoven. It's a very small house. It's in the south of the Netherlands. It's in the part of a former industrial area, which is called Stad S, and it's one a big estate. As you can see in the bottom of the image, there's a forest, and that's the estate of the former family of Philips, the factory, big multinational electricity company. They have a family house there, and recently it was announced that it's bought by the municipality of Eindhoven, and it will be transformed into a public park. That means that the whole character of this area will be maintained, but not private anymore, but public, which is good, I think. But our clients bought a very tiny piece of land, just on the opposite of this, let's say, park now, with a beautiful view and the crowns of the trees. This vacant piece of land is a habit in the Netherlands where you can then build your own dream house. And there are not a lot of these sites available. And our clients have a very tiny budget, also a tiny plot, and a big demand for many square meters. So we said, yes, let's go, let's try that. And we proposed two models. One is a bungalow or a patio house, which is just one floor with a hole in the middle where you plant a beautiful tree and then you live around the tree. The other model is the tower house, where you try to reduce the footprint of the house as much as possible. So you can actually have some distance towards your neighbors that were coming. They were one of the first people building on their plot, but we knew that the neighbors would approach them sooner or later. So they chose for the tower house variety. And then we actually make drawings for ourselves initially, because we want to be sure what the character of the building is, and therefore we test it by making drawings. That's one of the techniques of exploration, I would say, next to making models. It's also finding your own representation characters. And it's a very simple and small house. And one of the discussions we had with our clients was that we insisted on turning it 45 degrees on the plot. So you would actually have a view along the road that would be there, that you would actually see some depth instead of looking straight to the trees. But also that you would not have a sort of vis-a-vis situation with your neighbors, because again, the plot is very small. So we stood there on ladders with window frames to convince them, and we finally managed. But it's a very, again, like I said, it's a very simple structure. It's very repetitive. I always explain it as a group of rooms. So we have 2 bigger rooms and then 3 smaller rooms. And these rooms we try to individualize. So none of the rooms is the same. They all have just small differences in proportions, and that's mainly caused by the shifting of the floors. And we also try to establish this understanding by always putting emphasis on the transition from one room to the other room. So you would always be aware of the wall, crossing a border, so to say. That was caused by a door or a window, an interior window, or a big opening, or a height difference. And that's something you can not see from the outside, because the elevations of the project do not reveal the spatial differentiation in the interior. That's something we learned from out of laws, that the outside does not necessarily need to speak what's inside. But inside, you can see that it's quite rich in height differences. And one of the things that made the structure, let's say, affordable was that we used brick and concrete floors, and that we just were stacking the bricks on top of each other, and there were no other reinforcements necessary. It means that we also reached, let's say, the maximum height of what you can build in these bricks. And then we had a very simple system in which we could make differences in height in the floors. And that means that we see this as a group of rooms, like you can also see this in older houses where sometimes you live on the front, sometimes you live in the back. Rooms are allowing this. That's also our dream for this house. The interior was also thought of as a brick interior, and we had this agreement with the clients that they would change this after a year, when they lived there for a year. They also did not have the means at that time to completely plaster the walls. Oh, that was too fast. So, this is how the building started. You can also see the crowns of the trees, how it stands there alone. And how it actually is not revealing anything of its interior. So we thought of this as a building in one material, brick, and then we thought that needs a robust plinth with something that might resonate rustication, and then the top might become more light, even something that is tactile and textile, and something that is hanging, so much more light. And we are very insecure, so we do a lot of testing to find the right answer. This is a selection of our tests. This is already at the moment that we knew a bit what we wanted. And one of the things we found out was that pushing the windows to the edges, to the corners of the building, is giving much more emphasis on the corners itself, because it reminds you a bit of a Venetian palace, where in the middle you have a sort of closed front and the windows are pushed aside. I will elaborate a bit more on that later. By covering the top with cement, plaster, slurry, we started to explore a bit how to make to change the character of the building, and that was something we learned from Venturi Scott Brown's fire station number 4, where you can see how his surface actually makes the building, which is a quite normal and simple building, slightly extraordinary, because this white surface is not completely obeying to the silhouette of the volume. It stops too early, and therefore it stops halfway the window on one side, and on the other side it does not completely confirm the gate either. So it's a sort of autonomous figure that appears on the facade. That's something that inspired us a lot in thinking of adding just a very simple thin layer that could actually completely change the reading of a building. Besides, there's also this tradition in the Netherlands and also in other places where, let's say, normal bourgeois housing has is being built in brick and then embellished not with marble or natural stone, but with plaster elements. And these elements refer to classical elements like a keystone, water lines that actually, ornament, but also make sure that the building looks a bit more prominent, a bit more rich, you could say, but it's actually quite cheap. So that's also a strategy that we followed then by making keystones on top of the windows. But yeah, nowadays you don't really need a keystone because you have a lintel, so it's a symbol. But it does not completely confirm that it's only a symbol on the top, for example. It's just lifted up so it acknowledges the idea that there's a lintel, but also sometimes the keystones just start wandering around because of reasons of composition, and they are not bound to a window any longer. You might wonder what the door is doing there on the first floor. There's a balcony coming in later images, because these are all very preliminary images. But a bit more about the treatment of the facade. So for us it was very important to try to make building steps away from being too abstract, being abstract. So we spent quite some time on the making of this film, this layer that will provide lightness to the structure. And when you then meet a window, for us it was very important not to paint around the corner, but to stop at the corner, and then this all of a sudden becomes a sort of ornament. Also, we spent time on the joints between the bricks, which are slightly bulging out and then are brushed. This adds a layer of activity, and some people that pass by still are asking our clients living there whether the building is finished, and they get slightly annoyed by it, but I always have to smile a bit because I think that's also part of the roughness of the building or the tactility of the building. And this layer of joints also binds the base and the top together. And we had to do a couple of tests, of course. This is something we saw in the buildings of Sigurd Leverens around Stockholm, for example. And besides that, I just explained the building as a set of rooms. So I would say there's a big room, there's a smaller room, and then we have three rooms that are relatively equal. The middle one contains a stair and is very high. And the stair has to mediate, it's a bit like a snake, it has to mediate between all these different floor levels, so it goes up, starts here, meets the first floor, then continues, meets the second floor, goes up again, and then goes down, and then goes up again to the roof terrace. So it's quite a complicated stair. It's built in situ out of wood elements. And of course we had a bricklayer that was very fond of making the curve in the brick and carved it out, which he succeeded quite well, I think. For us these elements are quite important because they bring lightness to a building. This is how the building nowadays is there. So Joost, Dutch garden designer, designed the garden, and the neighbors also arrived. And now you can see how what these surfaces around the building, around the doors are doing. They're announcing the tables. So when you enter your house, you have a small canopy. And here on the other side, there's also a table standing, which allows you to enter the garden from the first floor. Currently, the people are working on the ground floor and on the third floor, and are mainly living on the first floor. They also installed the kitchen there. And this is how they started, quite rough. It was indeed cheap, but not so cheap for us, so to say, because we also had to we had to draw all the interior walls, the bond of the interior walls, the sockets, which is not, let's say, it's not, it's actually part of the thinking of architecture, and I think these banal elements is something you should also embrace and give a space and give a good spot and a good location. And here you can see how the wall is sticking out to emphasize the transition from one room to the other room. This is the atelier on the left side, and on the right side, the view from the kitchen to the dining room. The dining room is approximately 4 meters high, and this is the, let's say, the seating area. Again, you will always notice going from one room to the other room, here by stepping up. There's also an interior window from the dining room to the kitchen. This is the atelier. And here you can see the effect of moving the windows together to one corner, where they actually start to form an oriel or bay window. This is something we enjoyed a lot, because it means you are invited to experience the more diagonal views throughout the building. Our client is also helping a lot, because the client also decided to add their own layer. So they invited somebody to design their kitchen tailor-made, and everything. They got more and more enthusiastic, so they decided to design everything tailor-made, like frames and all kinds of elements in the house, like the bathtub, which is out of concrete. And this is now how the building is standing there with its neighbors. And then you see that it's not so exotic anymore, that it's actually quite well embedded among the neighbors that also have to follow the rules of the urban plan to make it right. Now, I'm going to move over to another project which is currently under construction. But the first project, it's a set of projects. It's the Aalst, as it's called. It's actually a sort of doubling of the city, because Nijmegen has an old core and needs to extend. And on the opposite of the river, the Waal, the extension is taking place, and that's a real large area. We have designed a couple of buildings in one of these parts, the new town. So it's an urban plan by the Zwarte Hond, and we were invited to work on a couple of cornerstones, so corner buildings that indicate a special moment in the urban fabric of this new town. 3 corner buildings, small, I would say a small street, and a double house. But I will talk first about the one that is already realized, that's Breda's, that's on the corner, which actually introduces the heart, as it's called, of this new area, which is a shopping center containing parking and shops for the whole area. Our building is along a big road, as you can see it here, curved, and it invites you to enter to the other road into the shopping area. Again, we make images. And this image of the building expresses the ambition to make a sort of billboard again that announces with a motive the heart of the Aalst. It's a building that has two identities, I would say. One which is more closed, which is representative and exceptional, and the other side is more modest and repetitive and simple. That's the right side. It's a housing block for starters. It contains approximately 30 units. They're rather modest. On the ground floor, there's commercial space. A very simple plan. And we spent quite some time on making ornamentation in brickwork. Zigzag patterns that sometimes would kiss and then form a heart. That means testing how these bricks can be stacked on top of each other and what happens if they get disturbed by a window, for example. This is how it can be found there nowadays. It contains a very clear gesture towards the big road, where it's, I would say, more urban, and then on the left side it dives down and becomes a bit more humble. The corner is also activated, as you can see. It diagonally looks over the crossing that is there. And it's a rather simple building made out of brick. We put some effort in trying to hide joints in the brickwork, in the masonry. I will come back to that later with another project. And this is the back side, which will be, of course, more green over time when the plants will take over. This is the silent side of the more informal side of the building. Where the people living also have their outside spaces on the gallery. And we spent quite some time in binding the plinth of the building together with the billboard, but not completely. So there's also a small shift, as you can see, because the billboard is a sort of standalone and it goes to its own. And when we were working on this project, it's worth mentioning the work of these Milanese architects, Sandor Naus, specifically this project in Via Lanzarote, Milano, where we learned quite some things from them. One of the things is they designed a rather big complex, but they subdivided this complex into several buildings. So the building you see here is part of the complex, and let's say the high building behind it is also part of the same complex. So the low building wants to be part of the street and behaves like a building that makes the street and confirms the street. The building behind, the taller building, is doing something else. It's making its own world behind. It relates to the garden that is in the back. That's one thing we learned, that you can actually also subdivide a big chunk into smaller parts that also can have their own articulation and vocabulary. The other thing we learned was that these architects from Milano in the 50s were very non-dogmatic, so they liked modernism, but they also liked classical architecture, and they didn't mind mixing these things up. So you see a lot of classical proportion building here, and then you see bank windows here. And then when you go around the corner, they make a facade again, which is based on punched holes again, and they all mash it up in one building. Besides, and that's where I think the real fun starts, they also treat the building not necessarily as a heavy building, but perhaps more as a house of cards, thin layers that are assembled together. They don't really fear showing that. Actually, they fully embrace that. I think that's very intriguing, and that fueled the thinking of the project in the last one as well. And here you can also see what they do with window types, just making small variants to put emphasis on the door, the entrance, for example. Now, that was the first building that is really realized, but we're working on a couple more. One of them is here, you can see under construction. So again, we go to this corner, and then the second one is a, let's not call it a tower, but it's a high house. It actually orientates to a central place, the market square, if you like, of this area. But it's also a bit like a campanile that needs to be visible from far away and indicates this central collective point. And then we made this small street with just normal houses, I would say, and then another corner building for elderly housing, and then a double house over there. But I will tell a bit about the tower. So it's an all-sided building that needs to be visible from all sides because you literally circle around this building upon approaching this city center. And then the exception is the orientation towards the market square. So we make models and we start to think about, it's actually a sort of stacked program because it's a plinth with commercial spaces, shops, and then on top we have a relatively low volume with housing that makes the street, confirms the street, you could say. And then on top, there's space for this building to grow up and to become tall and visible from all sides. So it's actually a sort of assemblage of a couple of volumes on top of each other with a rather complex layout. Then we said, well, perhaps the orientation should, to focus the orientation on the market, we give some extra relief or plasticity towards the market place by making a zigzag facade there. And to just briefly or just gently pull up the facade there. This is where it's under construction, and this is how it's currently there. And unfortunately, I cannot show you pictures of a finished project yet. That will come later, perhaps during the next lecture. Here we can see again the idea of making surfaces instead of always trying to confirm that it's a monolithic structure. Why? Well, we need to be, let's say, realistic. Building nowadays in brick is actually making thin layers of brick. It's not monolithic any longer. So we thought that's something that we could also show and express and make part of expression, make part of vocabulary. And here you can see the other side. There are big balconies or loggias here. And this is how it wants to operate in the square itself. It's a joint venture with a team of architects. But this is our corner, so to speak. I will also tell something about a project we've been working on here in your city, Antwerp, on You might be more familiar with this place than I am, although I've been there also in several moments during the day and the night. It's an intriguing place next to the Uni Center, which is vacant already for many years. And we were invited to do a small competition organized by the city of Hanover. And we did an analysis of this whole area and tried to come up with a good answer. One of the things we, of course, immediately saw was that the scale of this image center is very big, very challenging, and also the power central there in the back is also quite a distinctive element. So it's not so easy to operate between these two, let's say, giant structures. So what we actually said was, shall we then continue working on the fabric of linden? And one of the characteristics of linden is that it's a parameter block structure with quite clear blocks, but these blocks consist of individual houses. Some houses are larger, some are taller, and some of them are lower. We also realized that this corner is visible from many sides and also from far away, so it's also a point of orientation or a gate into a linden. And we started studying these typologies of, let's say, not skyscrapers, but Hochhäuser, which are houses which are a bit taller, but have an ambition to be quite visible and quite eloquent in their expression, and also have a notion of urbanity. So we found, of course, in German tradition, quite some beautiful examples. But we also found one in New York where you can actually see how these houses are very strictly bound to a certain width and then grow up higher and then create a sort of skyline which is beautifully diverse. So that is actually a strategy that we followed. We said we could actually make a set of 6 houses, and some of these houses connect to the scale of linden, and other houses can grow higher as a whole house and become more prominent as a point of orientation. And in that sense, they sort of blend in with the fabric of the existing, but simultaneously have the ability to stand out. It's a corner project again, and it's filled with offices, apartments for elderly housing, I mean, also free market apartments and commercial spaces on the ground floor and a parking underneath. It's important to always be able to make a distinction between, let's say, the different houses, the height of the houses, their individuality, and simultaneously how to bind them together as one group or one family. That means sometimes it needs to blend in, and in other places it needs to stand out. It's quite dense. Currently, the project was paused for, I would say, already 2 years. We hope to be able to continue in the forthcoming years. It requires a new investor to continue with it. Another building that is currently under construction is a social housing project in Hilversum, in the center of the Netherlands. It's a densification of a former elderly house, elderly home, I should say. It was demolished and replaced for 5 new buildings, containing also elderly housing. We are the last building. The other buildings here, and here have been realized by several other architects, like Sint and by Bali. We are in the middle, and we need to build on a parking deck. It is a project that we've been working on for approximately, I I would say also 6 or 7 years already, and we tried out quite some configurations, and then also COVID came in between, so there was a pause, of course, makes it a quite demanding project in that sense. Also because it's so in the middle and so close to the other buildings. That requires the building to be relatively slender, which is not super efficient, of course, because from the building economy, you would rather have a very thick building, which is rather compact. But that was not possible here. That required quite some acrobatics from our side to make the building feasible. So it's a real repetitive machine where the hands are speaking and everything in between is quite similar. In this social housing project, we try to also introduce a level of, let's say, a possibility for transformation, but that was not so easy. So we started with a long bar, and then we tried to break up the volume into two parts, where the meeting of the two parts is also the place where the entrance is and where the exception of the grid is. As you can see here, it's a corridor circulation where in the middle you can see the vertical circulation and also some collective spaces. It's built in a so-called tunneling system, a very efficient system, but it also really restricts the amount of, let's say, adaptivity in the future. And that was a topic of discussion. And I would say it's still possible to combine units, but it's something that in the future we would actually like to improve more and more, because we think that should also be possible in this tunneling system. So there's a lot of emphasis on the sustainability of the facade, the elevations. It's, I would say, it's a rather limited toolbox that we used, and again, there were some people on the table that were very helpful, like Giovanni Muzio, is one of his famous buildings, Cambuta in Milano, showed a sort of hamburger of different layers, which each of them having its own motifs, and its own window types, its own color, in a very simple way, making a distinction between the plinth, the middle, and the top of the building. There's also this fascination for this Dutch architect, Karel Weber, who's, I would say, almost the opposite of Giovanni Muzio, because he started thinking about rationalization and repetition, and he did something very, let's say, simple. He said one grid element is made out of prefab concrete, and I clad it with tiles. These tiles can have different colors, and then I need only 2 or 3 variations of the element, and with this I can make a big, grand urban gesture. And this allows, of course, to make social housing in a very efficient way. I think Karel Weber was slightly too ignorant in the detailing of his facade, but it's quite a brutal and bold gesture that I admire. Simultaneously, I have to cry a bit when I look at the detail. So that's something we try to learn from. This is the entrance hall, which is under construction currently. Again, we try to make a distinction of the 2 parts, not only the 2 parts in, let's say, a melting of 2 buildings, but also we try to enrich the stacking of floors on top of each other by making a distinction of a plinth, a middle, and a top. And one of our nerdish focal points was to avoid making visible dilatation joints, which you always need in brickwork, at least in the Netherlands. And it means that after a couple of meters, you always have to cut the brickwork because it needs to be able to move a bit when it heats up or cools down. And these dilatation joints are most of the time sort of improvised by the contractor in the last moment of the process, and then you find your facade sort of cut up in a sort of haphazard way. So we tried to develop a system which would solve a couple of things at the same time. So how to hide dilatation joints, I'll give them at least a location that we chose ourselves, and also how to make the building be able to age well by keeping the water. Is it time to stop? To age well by keeping the water from the facade. We used German bricks for this. They are very hard. They do not absorb a lot of moisture, which is good. That means that they will shine forever. And of course, we spend a lot of time on thinking of how this grid would act and perform on the facade. What would happen if a horizontal would meet a vertical? Sometimes the horizontal would be prioritized over the vertical, and sometimes not. This is how the building is currently there, and it's still under construction, as you can see. It's for us also an experiment to make brickwork look jolly and light instead of heavy and archaic. And it helps them to choose a color for your windows. We then work on exceptions like the head and how this comes along from the logic of the making of the facade. The facade, as you can see, is very repetitive. And we try to use form bricks to solve all the problems at the same time of how you make a lintel, how you change, how you go from one color of the brick facade to the other color of the bricks, how you color the joints from dark to light. And this is where you can also see the entrance. The entrance is part made of glazed bricks, and the grid is actually folding around and covering the whole facade, and that allows you to hide everything you don't want to see, and that is actually a very helpful tool for us. And here you can also see that the heads of the building are the places where there's more focus, where there's more gesture, and they stand out a bit more. This side is on a roundabout, as you can see here. The other side is more on a small street. Of course, one of the worries was the proximity towards the neighbors, and that led to the decision not to make balconies. That keeps me away sometimes during the night, but simultaneously, if you think about another line of balconies sticking out here, that almost becomes Phoenician, or you could shake hands with your neighbors. So perhaps this is better. Here you can also see how the entrance later will be visible from the street. Also because the entrance contains some unusual forms that really indicates that it's a special moment in the building. The last project, and then I'm finished, is the park pavilion in the park of Rotterdam Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This is a project which is a bit older. We did together with the Conservation and it's in one of the biggest national parks in the Netherlands. It's not only one of the biggest national parks, it's also it contains quite some heritage and some history. The family Miller and I lived there and collected a quite famous collection of art. Not only that, they also built structures and invited architects to make their hunting lodge, for example, but also invited Peter Beerens and Louise van der Rohe to do studies on their grounds to make new buildings. We did a competition for making a new visitor center there. That's number one. But there's also the Miller Museum located. It's really worth a visit with an extension, with a building of Henry van der Velde, the Belgian architect, and an extension by Louis Quist. And this is the hunting lodge by Bernhard, famous Dutch architect. And this is a sketch of our building. And then, of course, we had, after we had won the competition, we had a client that said, this is the last building we're going to build in 450 years. It's not allowed any longer to make a building here into nature. And we also have this heritage of all these big names, so it was quite an intimidating environment for us. One of the first questions we asked ourselves is, we're now going to make a visitor center here among all these famous buildings. What type of building are we going to actually make? Because a visitor center is not a very clear typology, is it? It's actually sort of a free thing. And one of the things we tried to do is we have to build here in an open spot in the forest, so to say. And in this open spot, it's a point of gathering for visitors. They are welcomed in this visitor center. And this visitor center contains approximately 3,000 square meters, and we did some attempts to make it look small and modest in several ways. We tried to not make it very long, but to make a curve like a banana, to not be able to completely see the full length of the building. We did not make one roof, but we made two roofs, so we divided the building into several parts. And we also tried to make quite big distinctions between the head of the building, the length of the building, and the tail of the building. And we made use of references that we immediately shared with our client during the first presentations. And one of the references was Lutyens in making country houses, and also another one was the Woodland Chapel by Gunnar Asplund, and a beautiful cafe in Vienna by Lacaton Vasal. And his Tickborn Court, for example, by Lutyens, was inspiring for us for two reasons. One, it creates a beautiful silhouette in the landscape, which is quite visible from far away as a point of orientation. It attracts. And the other reason was that Lutyens has a quite specific relation towards, let's say, nature. So he's making buildings in nature, relating to nature, but he's not making buildings that try to behave like nature. So it's not a building like a mountain or a building like a tree. No, it's a building like a building, accommodating and making all kinds of gestures towards nature, with making beautiful vistas by the positioning of windows. So firmly relating and connecting to the environment without completely blending in. This woodland chapel by Gunnar Asplund contains a secret. On the outside, it's a very humble, modest building that you would easily miss if you visit the woodland chapel, the woodland cemetery, where it's located. But once you enter, the surprise is that you see a beautiful dome, which is very actually monumental. And it's not revealed from the outside at all. So there's a disconnection between the exterior narrative, where the building tries to be modest, and the interior narrative, where the building has a completely detached, different story. We also realized that in this visitor center, a lot of things would change over time. In 10 years, furniture would change, or in 20 years. So we thought this beautiful space of the Provaci Cafe in Vienna has this beautiful ceiling, which is cladded with azulejos, these Portuguese tiles, and that is actually making the character of the whole space. That's actually firm enough to be sustainable, so everything underneath can change, but the space is actually defined by this ceiling. So these ingredients we took along in the design of our proposal. You have to imagine that you approach from this side, and the building needs to attract you from far away as a point of orientation. And from there, the building is a bit more abstract, I would say. It's more an emblem. So this side of the building is emblematic. It's something that does not immediately reveal what it's about. It's also a building that is, let's say, more based on a section, where the joy of the section is more the leading motive than the development of the plans. I would even dare to say that the plans are rather ugly, but in the section, that's where the joy is. So once you have seen this emblematic front of the building, you turn around the corner and you meet a fully glazed facade, that's this side of the building, where the building is actually not so bold and high and monumental anymore, but it is low because of the roof that dives down to the gutter line height of 3 meters. And the glass facade is slightly folded. And then once you enter this pavilion, you will meet the ceiling, which is also not completely visible yet from the outside. And that's, of course, a parallel to the Asplund building, where we also decided to detach the interior from the exterior. That's something that Baroque architects did, of course, already for ages. But then we, at a certain moment in time, said form follows function. And this also restricted our toolbox quite a lot. So we started by thinking the interior narrative is detached from the exterior narrative. That's what we learned from Asplund. And we said if we need to make a pitched roof, it's not necessary that the ceiling also needs to be pitched. So it can be a ceiling which contains a completely different gesture. And of course, then the discussions arrive on what to do with this space in between, this crochet. And we filled it up with all kinds of installations, of course. It's one continuous space. This is for visitors. They are being welcomed there in a central place in the middle. Whereas an information desk, there's a park shop, there's a restaurant, and upstairs there are meeting rooms. You have to imagine that the amount of visitors per year is between 500 to 600,000. Not all of them will visit this visitor center, of course, but it illustrates a bit the amount of people visiting this building. Back to the typology, we decided that this would be a country house, so a hunting lodge, and we have a country house. And this idea of a country house is sometimes taken relatively literal and sometimes more abstract. So it's a contemporary country house that welcomes you as a visitor. Here on the first floor you see the meeting rooms, roof, and how the interior works. So there's a strategy of vertical ribs that are all around. But sometimes the distances between these ribs are different. So on this side they are rather dense. When you turn around the corner, the spacing between these ribs changes. It's also a combination of two materials. So one of the first things that our client said approximately 9 years ago was no wood, because wood pollutes in the forest quite rapidly. We have a lot of maintenance. We don't want wood at all. So that required us to search for a very tough and sustainable material. That became a combination of hard brick, again a German brick that is clinker, which is not absorbing a lot of moisture and humidity, and then combined with a rather industrial aluminium roof and aluminium window frames that actually require hardly any maintenance and are easy to survive, that will easily survive the climate in this forest. We also liked using, let's say, quite banal industrial materials combined with more noble materials like this beautiful brick to make a contemporary country house. Here you can see how the entrance works in the middle of the dense volume. There are no other lights in the environment, so all the light comes from this country house. It has, of course, a head, which is more abstract, and a tail, which is more picturesque. And here on the left side, you see the forest side, which is the more tranquil side. The side you just saw here is the more dynamic side. It's quite busy. On weekdays and in the weekends especially. And on this forest side we have the meeting rooms. That's more the tranquil side, and we did quite some efforts to cover all the logistics that are involved with the restaurant, for example, on the ground floor, to keep them out of sight. Also the meeting room, that you don't see the truck passing by, but it's to load and unload. Here you can see the combination of the ribs that have different distances and that bind everything together. The color palette is a bit attuned to the sand grounds in the environment. Now, the direct context of the pavilion is more green. Its vegetation has grown now. And during the trip, we also made this these impressions to figure out how the performance of the building could work, especially when you make this folded facade, how that works. This is what you will see when you enter and look towards the information desk in the shop. And this is how the folded facade works. Allows you to sit close to the light and direct connection with the outside. When you're sitting outside, you can also find coverage in these folds. They work like Orioles or bay windows. And this line of 3 meters is continuously going throughout the whole space here, where we have a wooden paneling going all around. This wooden paneling is also referring to what we find in country houses to give a sort of accommodating feeling, I would say. And it's a long space, but curving this space, it made us think about this beautiful house of Toyo Ito for his sister, where he curves actually one space, and therefore he does not actually break the continuity of this space, but does allow to make different programming in this space. That's a bit how this works as well. When you're in the restaurant, you don't see the shop if you are in the back, and vice versa. This is the middle of the building, which is most dynamic. Again, the roots. And this is the climax. That's a fireplace. It used to be there in the previous small visitor center. It's way too big, this fireplace, because it's more simple. It's completely tailor-made. It's exaggerated. Our client was very occupied about the height of these beer heads, because that's also part of the culture of our client. He's the guardian of the forest, so to say, and that means also there's also a hunting culture involved there. I don't feel familiar with it, so I did not understand that much. But I did enjoy the making of this fireplace, which has tiles which were tailor-made, and the steelwork was tailor-made. You can also go up, and you go up, you will find a long corridor towards the meeting rooms. And the meeting rooms contain the same palette of materials throughout the whole building, which creates coherence. And I would say it's a sort of mashup of typologies. It contains elements of a country house. It also contains elements that were imported from other references. And altogether, it's held together by a strategy of material and ribs, but actually it's a building that is assembled, I would say. You also don't see the steel structure, it's hidden everywhere. It was actually not a real motive to show the construction at all. Thank you.
We have the addition to discussion. Please ask the question. Yes. I hope you're ready for that.
Of course.
To start, I had no first question. As we discussed today also when we looked at our students' projects, we had several times deployed our current architecture is of course suffering and reductionism. So we have to live with the fact that our architecture tends to become just a simple box and you cut some hoods in it, and it's windows and that's about it. So abstraction in architecture led us to reducing beams, forced minimalism, and so on and so on, and which of course makes it very difficult to create something they could say in the architecture that people can relate to and appropriate and so on and so on. So we, as Philip said, we risk to make buildings which just slip off of their flatness and simple kind of appearance. So and what you do is somehow your counter statement and you try to, as you see yourself, the toolbox is limited, the toolbox has been limited, and you try to recreate it kind of toolbox to improve this phenomenon, to counterbalance this phenomenon. And there are several things in it. There's this aspect of abstraction, there's symbols which you condition, also symbolic elements. And in general, it touches the subject of decoration. Decoration has also, to my point of view, a lot to do with authenticity. So I found personally the most convincing decoration in architecture was decoration made by people themselves. In traditional architecture without architects, as you find in Africa or India, paint the walls, they do it themselves, and that's, of course, life, which is expressed also in this architecture, which makes this architecture really their kind of thing. And, that seems to be a natural decoration or kind of authentic decoration. All architecture made by architects, and being on is like suffering from this aspect of alienation. So you're creating for the others beauty with elements that you add, which have no direct use, which in the best sense, in the best sense, in a lot of senses come out of tectonic logic. You have to create a theme to handle a closed wall where there are only small windows in it, and make it bigger or bigger, and like that. The way you use these elements or use decoration, for instance, is variety. Yeah? So the last example was like with these elements, this brick building with these zigzag brick shapes. Can you elaborate on that? What is your idea on this? To call it like this extended toolbox, and make it also the subject of decoration and alienation and how you position yourself as architects and you design decoration for the people.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that because decoration or ornamentation, I would say we try to design character. And why character? To avoid abstract, generic architecture, because we are not interested in generic abstract architecture, because we think it's good to include a sense of place, a context, and it's not to be taken too literal. Context can also be a city context or even a wider context or a cultural context. And we think that in some cases where we work, not in all the cases, but character is helping to identify the surrounding and to even orientate in a context. And of course, that's not necessary everywhere, but in quite some cases, it's helpful. Another reason for using decoration or ornamentation is to enrich a facade and to charge a facade or a building that's not reduce it to facade, to charge a building with narratives. We think that is a way to make architectural culture survive. If we keep on telling stories with our buildings, we are in constant dialogue, and of course we can have a debate about it. And it's a development and a reaction towards indeed more shallowness in architecture, but it's also a way. It's not only an intellectual debate about tectonics. It's also a way to, and that's an ambition to hope we can relate to people making use of it. That we really think and hope that this makes the building more precious. And our biggest example of that is, of course, the MONADNOCK building in Chicago, which is there for many years and is able to survive for many years because it contains character. It's a very flexible box, but it's not a box at all. because it contains a couple of ingredients which makes it very characteristic. And we think that that matters in life, that people therefore can appreciate it and as something precious they want to maintain, not only on a functional level, but also as something they want to be in and to be surrounded with. If buildings can do that, and we're doing good, and if we need decoration for that, then that's a very helpful and functional decoration, I would say.
We have feedback from people. How they perceive that?
Yes.
Is the narrative really working? Is the storytelling telling a story others understand?
Well, that's always a tricky question, because there are always layers that are understood by, let's say, colleagues and not understood by, let's say, uninformed people. But there are people that, yes, that inhabit the buildings and appreciate it and can also explain why they think it's a good building for them, because it's spatially offering a good ground plan, but also it's distinctive, so to say. It's something that we appreciate. But I don't have a full record of let's say, people sending us flowers, saying, you did well, architect. So just to illustrate that, the building you saw, Breda, which is having pink windows, there's no discussion, but in another project in Nijmegen where we have pink window frames, this is not social housing, but people have been buying these houses. They were a bit surprised and they were not appreciating these pink windows. So some of these, let's say, I would say stepping out of the convention of making very silent buildings is not appreciated. That also happens. Yeah.
Maybe there's questions in the audience.
Feel free. I'm not online, I'm here.
For your decoration, you often use these simple forms like triangles or circles, while your architecture isn't that simple. And I want to ask, why do you have this table?
The last part of your question.
Why do you have this ambition to use these simple forms?
Well, some of these forms make exceptions, and an exception is sometimes welcome. For example, in this building, the long building, the social housing building, using a triangle in a circular form is a way of indicating the entrance. It's done by color, by glazed bricks, by a different format of bricks, but we thought that would not be enough. So, and sometimes it's also a way to make, to step away from seriousness and to make something which is slightly more playful and light. Sometimes these forms help in loosening up. There's not much theory behind that, other than trying to break repetition, I would say.
Thank you.
Yes?
Yeah, I have two questions really. First of all, have you ever had the chance to do a transformation project?
Not yet, and we're really longing for it.
Yeah. Do you think your approach will change, or that's very theoretical?
Well, I find it hard to answer that because I think a transformation really requires analysis of the existing. And depending on that, the outcome and conclusions of that analysis would actually lead to what a possible answer could be. And I cannot say whether that would be a strategy of contrast or a strategy of blending in or of continuation. It's a bit.
Describe the question. No, but it's very banal question. But it's interesting that you say you'd like to.
Yes, absolutely.
But then another question or something I was asking myself, this introduction you gave in the beginning, do you change it up a lot? This thoughts on your attitude towards architecture, or is it something that you figured out very early on and that remains the same all these years? Or do you sometimes go back and look at all your projects and kind of reflect on whether you are still on this up view set?
No, it changed. It changed over time. Or yes, it changed over time. There's a development where we started being in love with MONADNOCK building, wanted to build firm, robust buildings that would last forever. We gradually understood that this was perhaps, gradually, it actually immediately started when we got our first commission for the beach pavilion, that we could actually only reject this commission, or we had to change our thoughts, and we chose the latter. So we said, well, perhaps thinking about continuity, a culture of continuity is more on an abstract level instead of a literal level. Perhaps we can just continue telling narratives about typologies, about things we found in buildings that we find valuable and usable in this specific location. That is also a form of continuity, I would say, and of sustainability. So it became a bit more abstract. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is that we then still, for a while, wanted to make firm, solid buildings, monolithic buildings. And that gradually changed when we started realizing that most of the time we're assembling materials, making a layer for the construction, making a layer for the installation, making a raincoat out of cladding of brick or something else. That made us realize that it becomes a bit strange to all the time try to do a lot of efforts to confirm that it's monolithic while it's actually really very far away from that. That does not mean that if we would get the chance to make something monolithic that we would embrace that, but it's in the way of completely designing and thinking about coherence that really shifted towards making buildings that are much more assembled, and then acknowledging this assemblage and actually acknowledging it means also to celebrate it. And that gives an enormous amount of freedom, which we find much more intriguing at the moment. And then the question arrives, but then everything could be deconstructed and fall apart. But that's not actually what it's about. It's still the project requires a sort of internal logic or coherence that binds everything together.
But now a third question. Considering this necessity of maybe bricolage or at least assemblage, do you think that perhaps working within the existing eventually also makes this typological based approach obsolete?
No, I don't think so. Working in the existing,
like transformation part, because if it becomes more about like looking at what is there, about elements that are existing, about also the reality of construction being many parts and rarely one, is it still sensible to think of buildings and types and then structure architecture on that thinking? Or is it maybe eventually more about elements and how we deal with them?
I would really have a hard time disqualifying typologies, but I can imagine that there are situations where they are not helpful. But if you want to do a transformation of an existing building you transform a factory building into something collective or public, and I can imagine that part of the rereading is that you also tell that there's a new program that requires a new presentation to the public, and then the typology can be helpful. But perhaps in your context, the typology can be something that is very restrictive. But in my world, typology is a helper to define what you're doing. But I think we can completely feel free to make combinations of typologies. And that means that typology is much less restrictive. And then that's perhaps also a part of your question. Then it becomes more an assemblage of typologies and fragments or elements. But I don't always feel the urge to celebrate bricolage as a sort of picturesque adventure, because I think coherence is also very helpful. I give long answers, I know. More questions? So it was all clear.
Everybody getting tired?
Yeah.
Maybe one last one. Would you see yourself as a rationalist architect? Or would you define your architecture as being part of the realm of rationalism?
I always think we are a European architects. Is that a regional approach?
No, rationalism in the sense of that structures defining the basis of architecture. That you make decisions on the basis of logic.
Connected to the habits of an environment.
There's variation how you define it, of course. It's not a dogmatic definition.
No.
Or how would you define it?
Well, perhaps I would really like to answer your question, but the definition of regionalism is
Rationalism.
Oh, sorry. Oh, that's a short answer. Yes, rational. I would say that is the basis of our. That's one of the fundamentals of our thinking. No, sorry, no hesitation there. I completely misunderstood your. It's also the title of the series. No, rationalism is relating again to a set of conventions within architecture that really helps. I think that means, for me, rationalism stands for acknowledging that if you are building on a corner, that you can search for examples of corners in the city structure, that you don't sort of start from scratch, like doing all kinds of city inventions, that you study actually examples and then try to either embrace these or try to invent something new on the basis of this. That's actually what rationalism stands for me, that you have a couple of things that are logic and are not only depending on, let's say, a bright idea, but it's also something you can just work on without having bright ideas. And that's also helpful.
Okay. If there's no more questions, then thank you very much.